He gave his only jacket to a shivering woman at a lonely bus stop, unaware that this one act of kindness would change his life forever. Welcome to Soul of Kindness. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe, because here, one small kindness can create a lifetime of miracles. The cold that night was merciless, the kind that didn't just chill the air but seemed to creep straight into the soul, and the bus stop stood like a lonely witness under a flickering streetlight, its rusted bench slick with moisture and its glass panels cracked from years of neglect, while Arav stood there rubbing his hands together, breathing into them in a hopeless attempt to find warmth, his shoulders slumped from exhaustion after another long, unforgiving shift at the warehouse, where time moved slowly and pain settled deep into the bones, and as he stared down the empty road, he wondered how life had become such a constant struggle, how every day felt like a quiet battle against bills, responsibilities, and dreams that had slowly faded into survival, when suddenly his eyes drifted to a woman standing a few feet away, slightly apart from him, her posture stiff, her thin coat doing nothing to protect her from the sharp wind that cut through the night, and he noticed how she trembled despite trying to hide it, how her fingers were red and tense as she clasped her bag close to her chest, and something about her struck him, not pity, not curiosity, but a quiet recognition of loneliness that felt painfully familiar, and for a moment he told himself to look away, to mind his own business, because he had learned the hard way that kindness often came at a cost he could barely afford. Yet the wind grew stronger, making the streetlight sway and cast distorted shadows, and he saw her flinch again, her breath hitching as she tried to steady herself, and without realizing it, Arav's heart tightened, memories surfacing of his mother shivering during winter nights when the heater broke, of how helpless he had felt then, and before his mind could argue, before fear or logic could stop him, his hands moved to the zipper of his jacket, the old, worn jacket that was the only real shield he had against the cold, the one thing that made nights like this bearable, and he stepped toward her, his voice soft and uncertain as he held it out and said she looked cold, that she should take it, and the woman turned, clearly startled, her eyes widening as she looked at the jacket and then at him, disbelief written across her face, as if she hadn't expected kindness from a stranger, especially one who looked just as tired and cold as she felt, and she protested weakly, telling him he needed it more, that she would be fine, but he shook his head with a small, awkward smile, insisting that the bus would come soon and that he'd manage, and after a long pause she accepted it, wrapping it around herself as a quiet sigh escaped her lips, relief washing over her face, and she thanked him, her voice gentle yet heavy with something unspoken, and they stood there together in silence, two strangers sharing a moment that felt strangely intimate despite the lack of words, the bus eventually arriving with a hiss of brakes and a burst of warm air, and they boarded without another word, sitting apart yet somehow connected by that simple act. And when she got off a few stops later and tried to return the jacket, he waved it away, telling her to keep it, that he could get it later. And she paused, looking at him as if trying to etch his face into her memory, asking his name, and when he told her, she smiled softly and gave him hers before disappearing into the night, leaving Arav standing there with a strange mix of cold and warmth swirling inside him, unaware that this fleeting moment, this single decision made in the heart rather than the mind, was the first step toward a future he could never have imagined. And as he walked home under the dark sky, shivering but oddly at peace, he had no idea that the woman wrapped in his jacket was not just another passenger, but a powerful CEO whose life, and his own, had just quietly changed forever. The morning after the cold night at the bus stop arrived with a dull gray sky and a sharp ache in Arav's throat. And as he sat up on his narrow bed in the tiny one-room apartment, he instinctively reached for the hook on the wall where his jacket usually hung, only to feel empty air, and for a brief moment a flicker of doubt passed through his mind, wondering whether kindness was a luxury he could no longer afford. Yet as he coughed softly and wrapped an old shawl around his shoulders, he felt something deeper than regret, a quiet sense of rightness, as if he had done something his tired soul desperately needed, and after a quick wash and a simple breakfast of dry bread and tea, he stepped out into the morning rush, joining the stream of people who looked just as worn down by life as he felt. The city already buzzing with horns, footsteps, and the constant urgency of survival. And during the crowded bus ride to the warehouse, his mind kept drifting back to the woman, to the way she had looked at him when he refused to take the jacket back, as if no one had ever done something like that for her before. And the thought puzzled him, because she hadn't looked poor or helpless, just distant, like someone used to standing alone even in a crowd. And when his shift finally began, the hours dragged on under the harsh fluorescent lights, his muscles burning as he lifted heavy boxes and moved pallets, his breath uneven from the lingering cold. And during his short lunch break, he sat behind the warehouse on an upturned crate, holding a steaming cup of cheap tea between his hands, scrolling aimlessly through his phone in an attempt to distract himself from the fatigue that weighed on his body, when a headline suddenly caught his attention, bold letters flashing across the screen, and as the article loaded slowly over the weak signal, his heart skipped a beat, because the woman staring back at him from the photograph was unmistakably the same one from the bus stop, though now. She was dressed in an elegant coat, standing confidently in a glass-walled office, her posture straight, her expression composed and powerful, and the headline identified her as Maya Reichand, the CEO of a global corporation worth billions, known for her sharp leadership and disciplined approach to business. And Arav blinked, convinced for a moment that his exhaustion was playing tricks on him. But as he read further, the truth settled heavily in his chest. The article describing her influence, her achievements, her reputation as someone who never relied on anyone, and he let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh, shaking his head at the absurdity of it all, because the woman who had shivered at the bus stop, who had accepted his jacket with hesitant gratitude, was the same woman whose decisions shaped industries and economies, and the contrast felt almost unreal. And for the rest of the day, Arav worked on autopilot, his thoughts tangled with questions he had no answers to, wondering why someone like her had been standing alone at a broken bus stop, why she had looked so fragile despite her power, and whether she would ever think of him again now that the moment had passed. And across the city, Maya sat in her spacious office surrounded by glass walls and polished surfaces, yet she felt colder than she had the night before, her assistant briefing her on schedules and meetings she barely heard, her eyes drifting instead to the worn jacket folded neatly over a chair, its frayed cuffs and faded fabric standing out sharply against the luxury of the room, and she reached out to touch it, her fingers brushing over the rough material as memories of the bus stop flooded back, of the wind, the darkness, and the young man who had offered her warmth without hesitation, without knowing who she was or what she owned. And something about that simplicity unsettled her, because in her world, nothing was ever given without expectation. Every gesture measured, every kindness calculated. And yet Arav had asked for nothing, not even gratitude. And as the day went on, she found herself distracted, her thoughts returning again and again to his tired eyes and quiet smile, and during a break between meetings she surprised her assistant by asking to find information on a warehouse worker named Arav, giving only a first name and a general area, insisting it wasn't for publicity or reward, but simply to return something that belonged to him, though deep down she knew it was more than that, because the jacket had reminded her of a part of herself she had buried long ago, a time before titles and boardrooms, when life had been simpler and kindness had come naturally. And as evening approached, Arav found himself back at the same bus stop, the cold already settling in, unaware that somewhere not far away, the woman whose life he had touched with a single selfless act was making a decision that would soon bring their paths together again, proving that sometimes the quietest moments carry the loudest truths, and that kindness, once given, has a way of finding its way back. That evening, as the city lights flickered on one by one and the cold began to sharpen again, Arav stood at the same bus stop where everything had started, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, and his mind still tangled in the revelation he had discovered earlier that day, and every passing car seemed louder than usual, every shadow heavier, because now he knew the truth about the woman who had worn his jacket, and the knowledge made the memory of that simple moment feel almost unreal, as if it belonged to a different life entirely. And just as he shifted his weight to escape the creeping chill, the low hum of an approaching engine caught his attention, and a sleek black car slowed to a stop near the curb, its presence starkly out of place in the worn, forgotten corner of the street. And before he could process what was happening, the door opened and she stepped out, Maya, dressed elegantly yet unmistakably wearing his old jacket over her clothes. And for a brief second the world around them seemed to fade, the noise of traffic dulling as their eyes met, his wide with surprise, hers warm with recognition, and she greeted him by name, her voice calm but carrying an emotion he couldn't quite place, and Arav stood frozen, words caught in his throat, unsure whether to bow, apologize, or laugh at the strange twist of fate, and she broke the silence by thanking him again, this time not as a stranger, but as someone who had thought deeply about what he had done, and she explained how she had found him, how the jacket had stayed with her like a reminder she couldn't ignore, and though Arav tried to downplay his gesture, insisting it was nothing, she shook her head, telling him that to her it had been everything, because it had reminded her of a kindness she had not felt in years, and she asked if he would join her for tea nearby, not as a CEO inviting a worker, but as one human being speaking to another. And after a moment of hesitation, Arav agreed, curiosity and a strange sense of trust guiding his steps, and they sat at a small roadside cafe where the tables were uneven, and the air smelled of boiling tea leaves, a place far removed from the polished restaurants Maya usually visited, yet she seemed more at ease there than anywhere else. And as they talked, she listened intently as Arav spoke about his life, his struggles, his mother's illness, and the constant uncertainty that shaped his days, and for once he did not feel invisible, because she listened without checking her phone, without glancing at the time, her eyes focused on him as if his words truly mattered, and when it was her turn to speak, she surprised him by admitting how lonely her life was despite all her success, how the higher she climbed the more distant people became, until kindness had turned into a transaction rather than a feeling, and she confessed that standing at that bus stop had been her attempt to remember what it felt like to be ordinary, to exist without protection or privilege, and Arav realized then that the cold she had felt was not just from the weather, but from years of emotional isolation, and as the conversation deepened, an unspoken bond formed between them, not of romance or ambition, but of mutual understanding, two lives shaped by very different struggles yet connected by the same need to be seen, and before they parted, Maya handed him a card, offering him an opportunity to work with her company, making it clear that it was not charity but a chance to grow, and Arav felt a mix of fear and hope rise within him, because accepting it meant stepping into a world he had never imagined for himself, yet refusing it felt like turning away from a door that had opened for a reason. And as he watched her leave once more, this time returning the jacket to his hands, he understood that their meeting had already changed something inside him, because for the first time in a long while, the future no longer felt like an endless repetition of hardship, but like a path with possibilities. And as he walked home under the city lights, the jacket warm against his skin, Arav sensed that the distance between two worlds had quietly begun to disappear, bridged not by power or wealth, but by a single moment of genuine kindness. Time moved forward in quiet but powerful ways after that night, and for Arav, life began to change not suddenly, but steadily, like the slow warming of hands that had been cold for far too long, and though he initially doubted himself, replaying Maya's words again and again in his mind, he finally accepted the opportunity she had offered, stepping into her company with the same humility and honesty that had defined him at the bus stop. And the first days were overwhelming, the polished floors, the structured routines, the unfamiliar language of meetings and expectations making him feel small and out of place. Yet instead of judgment he found guidance. Instead of pressure he found patience, because Maya had made it clear to everyone that Arav was there because of his character, not as a symbol or a story, but as a person with potential. And as weeks turned into months, Arav learned quickly, his discipline shaped by years of hardship, his integrity earning quiet respect, and for the first time in his life he felt something he had never known before: stability, the kind that allowed him to breathe without fear, to plan beyond the next bill or the next meal, and with a steady income he was able to provide proper care for his mother, watching her health slowly improve, her tired eyes filling with relief as she realized her son no longer carried the entire weight of the world on his shoulders. And yet, despite all these changes, Arav never forgot where it had begun, never forgot the cold night, the flickering streetlight, and the choice he had made without thinking. And on the other side of the city, Maya found herself changing too, though her transformation was quieter and more internal, because leading a powerful corporation had never been the challenge for her, but rediscovering her humanity was, and inspired by that single act of kindness, she began to reshape the culture around her, encouraging empathy over fear, dignity over distance, launching programs that focused not on charity that humiliated, but opportunity that empowered. And in meetings she spoke differently now, listening more, observing more, remembering that behind every role and every title was a human being with unseen struggles. And the old jacket, now carefully cleaned and preserved, remained in her office as a reminder, not of wealth or power, but of the night she had been cold and someone had cared. And eventually, at a company gathering attended by employees from every level, Maya stood on stage and told the story, holding up the worn jacket and explaining how a stranger's kindness had reminded her of a truth she had forgotten, that real leadership begins with compassion. And as she spoke, Arav stood among the crowd, not singled out, not celebrated, but deeply aware that his simple choice had created a ripple far beyond his own life. And the applause that followed was not loud or dramatic, but sincere, filled with a shared understanding that kindness did not belong only to the powerful or the wealthy, but to anyone willing to act. And later that night, as Arav waited once again at a bus stop, this time not out of necessity but habit, he watched the city move around him, the same cold air brushing his face, and he realized that while his circumstances had changed, his values had not, because kindness had never been a transaction for him. It had been a reflex, a reflection of who he was, and he understood then that the true miracle was not that a CEO had noticed him, but that two people from completely different worlds had met at the same place of vulnerability and seen each other clearly. And as buses came and went and strangers passed by, Arav smiled softly to himself, knowing that life would still bring challenges, still test his strength, but also knowing that one small, selfless act could echo across lives, shaping futures in ways no one could predict. And somewhere in the city, Maya looked out over the skyline from her office window, feeling warmer than she had in years, because she knew that no matter how high she rose, she would never forget the night she stood shivering at a bus stop and learned that the greatest power in the world was not money or status, but kindness freely given, a simple gesture that changed two lives forever.